Welcome back to God's story in our sacred journey. Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. In our last episode, we followed the wise men as they begin their quest, guided by a star. Today we join Mary and Joseph as they undertake a challenging journey to Bethlehem, obeying Caesar's decree. But this journey is more than just a trip, it's a step toward fulfilling a divine promise. Let's walk with them.
The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the small town, its rays falling on the uneven stone streets and modest homes. The sounds of daily life, a donkey braying, children laughing, a merchant bartering, were interrupted by the sudden echo of heavy footsteps. A Roman messenger, clad in a cloak of deep crimson, unfurled a scroll in the town's square and began to read, his voice cutting through the chatter like the sharp ring of a bell. All must return to their ancestral towns to register for the census by order of Caesar Augustus. The words rippled through the crowd like a cold wind, silencing whispers and stiffening postures. Joseph, standing at the edge of the square, clenched his fists. He knew what this meant. Bethlehem, the city of David, was nearly 90 miles away, and Mary, carrying the weight of their unborn child, was nearing the final days of her pregnancy. The journey would be long, the roads unforgiving. Joseph returned to their modest home, his mind racing. Inside, the room was filled with the gentle hum of domestic life. Mary sat near the window, her face serene in the fading light, her hands resting lightly on her swollen belly. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "It's the census," Joseph said, his voice tight. "We have to go to Bethlehem." Mary's expression remained calm, though a flicker of concern passed over her features. "We'll go," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "God will guide us." Joseph hesitated, his gaze dropping to the worn wooden table between them. "It's a long way," he murmured. "The roads are hard, the nights cold." He stopped himself. There was no need to speak of the dangers, bandits, wild animals, or the strain of the journey on her fragile condition. Mary already knew. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "This isn't just Caesar's decree," she said softly. "This is part of something greater. We must trust." Joseph exhaled, the weight of her faith steadying him. He stood and began gathering what little they had: a water skin, a bundle of bread, a small pouch of coins. His movements were deliberate, though his mind was clouded with worry. Would she endure the journey? Would they find safety in Bethlehem? He could not answer these questions, but he knew they had no choice. Outside, the town was alive with preparation. Families loaded carts, packed provisions, and argued over logistics. The Roman decree had upended their lives, forcing them into motion like leaves caught in a restless wind. But for Joseph and Mary, the journey carried a significance far beyond taxes and census records. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the hills, Joseph paused by the door and looked back at Mary. She smiled faintly, her hand resting over her belly. "At first light," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We'll leave at first light." The night settled over them, heavy with anticipation and unspoken fears, but in the quiet of their small home there was also a flicker of hope, a sense that this journey, imposed by the powers of Rome, was destined by a much higher authority. The dim glow of an oil lamp flickered against the walls of the small home as Joseph paced the floor. His footsteps, though soft, echoed with the weight of his thoughts. He stopped briefly to glance at the scroll lying on the table, the decree from Caesar Augustus, and then turned his eyes toward Mary. She sat near the hearth, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze steady, despite the uncertainty hanging in the air. "It's not safe," Joseph began, his voice heavy with concern. "The road to Bethlehem is long and dangerous, especially for you in your condition." His words faltered as he gestured toward her rounded belly, the life within her so fragile, yet destined for something extraordinary. Mary lifted her head, her face calm but resolute. "We must go," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "It's not Caesar's decree we follow, but God's plan." Joseph sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to shield her, to keep her safe within the walls of their home. But he knew she was right. This journey wasn't just an obligation. It was a step into the unknown, a path they had no choice but to walk. He sat down across from her, his hands clasping together tightly. "We'll need to prepare carefully," he said, his tone more measured now. "Food, water, and blankets for the cold nights. The donkey will carry you when you tire." Mary nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "God will provide," she whispered, her faith unwavering. Her words, though simple, carried a profound reassurance that steadied Joseph's resolve. Outside, the faint sounds of the town preparing for the census reached their ears, voices calling out, carts creaking under the weight of supplies, and animals braying in the distance. The world was moving, and they would soon be swept along with it. Joseph stood and moved toward the small chest where their belongings were kept. He began packing with deliberate care: a water skin, a small pouch of coins, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Each item felt insignificant against the journey ahead, but it was all they had. As the lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the room, Joseph turned to Mary once more. "At first light," he said, his voice steadier now, "we'll leave." Mary nodded, her eyes lifting to meet his. "At first light," she echoed. The room fell into a quiet stillness once again, but the weight of their decision brought a strange sense of peace. The journey would be difficult, but together they would face whatever lay ahead. And in their hearts they carried the unshakable belief that this path, however uncertain, was guided by a divine hand. The first rays of dawn painted the horizon in soft hues of orange and pink as Joseph led the donkey out of the yard, its hooves clicking lightly against the stones. Mary sat atop the animal, her hands clutching a small bundle of belongings, her body swaying gently with its steps. The road ahead was long, and though they had rested the night before, the weight of the journey already pressed heavily on them. The dirt path winding through the hills was uneven, dotted with loose stones that made each step uncertain. The donkey stumbled once, and Joseph reached out instinctively, steadying it with a firm hand. He glanced up at Mary, her face pale but calm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Mary nodded, though the strain was evident in her expression. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice soft but resolute. "Let's keep going." The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wild thyme growing along the edges of the path. It should have been refreshing, but with each mile the coolness gave way to a relentless sun that rose higher, beating down on them without mercy. Joseph wiped the sweat from his brow, his tunic clinging to his back. He glanced at the horizon, the hills rolling endlessly ahead, and felt the weight of the distance they still had to cover. Around midday, they paused under the sparse shade of an olive tree. Joseph unpacked a small water skin and handed it to Mary, watching as she drank in slow, measured sips. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Rest a while," Joseph urged. "The heat will pass soon." Mary shook her head gently, her hands folding over her belly. "We can't stop for too long," she said. "We need to reach the next village before nightfall." He didn't argue. He knew she was right. The open roads were dangerous after dark, bandits lurked in the shadows, and wild animals prowled the hills. But he couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him, the fear that the journey was taking too great a toll on her. As they resumed their path, the terrain grew steeper, the donkey straining against the incline. Joseph walked beside it, his hands gripping the reins tightly. He whispered quiet prayers under his breath, asking for strength, for endurance, for protection. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air around them thick with dust kicked up by their feet. But Mary's resolve never wavered. Though her body was weary, her faith carried her forward. She looked ahead, her eyes fixed on the path, as if she could already see the destination awaiting them. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, they reached a small clearing where they could rest. The The sky above them turned a deep shade of violet, stars beginning to peek through the fading light. Joseph helped Mary dismount, his hands steadying her as she leaned on him. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Joseph looked up at the stars, their light faint but constant. He thought of the promise that had brought them here, the unseen hand guiding their steps. Despite the challenges of the day, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that they were not alone on this journey. The sun had sunk lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty road. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the donkey's hooves against the earth. Joseph walked steadily beside Mary, his steps deliberate, his hand never straying far from the reins. Though his body ached from the day's journey, his mind churned with worry. Mary, seated atop the donkey, shifted slightly, her hand resting over her belly. Her face was pale, and her breaths measured. She had barely spoken all day, conserving her strength for the road ahead. But even in her silence, there was a calm resolve about her, a quiet faith that seemed to anchor her through the strain of the journey. "Let's stop for a moment," Joseph said, his voice firm but gentle. He guided the donkey off the road to a small patch of shade beneath a lone fig tree. Mary nodded faintly, grateful for the reprieve. As Joseph helped her down, his hand steadying her carefully, he searched her face for signs of exhaustion. "We've come so far already," he said, his tone filled with both encouragement and concern. "But if it's too much, we can rest longer." Mary shook her head, a faint smile softening her expression. "We'll be fine," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "The journey isn't easy, but it's necessary. We have to trust that God will give us the strength we need." Joseph lowered his gaze, her words settling into his heart. He knew she was right. This journey wasn't just about reaching Bethlehem. It was about faith, about trusting in the unseen plan that had guided them this far. He knelt beside her, drawing out a small flask of water and a piece of bread from his bag. "Here," he said, handing her the flask. "You need to stay strong." As she drank, he closed his eyes briefly, whispering a silent prayer. His words were simple but earnest, a plea for endurance, for safety, for guidance. When he opened his eyes, Mary was watching him, her gaze steady and filled with understanding. "We'll make it," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "God hasn't brought us this far to abandon us now." Joseph nodded, her faith bolstering his own. Together they rose, ready to face the road ahead. The sun dipped closer to the horizon, its light golden and soft, casting the world in a glow that felt almost sacred. The journey was far from over, but in that moment Joseph felt a renewed sense of purpose. As they continued, the path grew steeper, the air cooler. The first stars began to emerge, faint pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Joseph glanced upward, his heart steadying at the sight. The stars had always guided travelers through the night, and now they seemed to guide him too. Mary shifted slightly on the donkey, her hands folded over her lap. Do you see them?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Stars?" Joseph replied. She nodded. "They remind us of his promise. Even in the darkest night, there's always light to guide us." Joseph's lips curved into a faint smile. "Yes," he said, "and we'll follow it, together." The road stretched on before them, uncertain and challenging, but their faith, unwavering through every trial, carried them forward. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time Joseph and Mary approached the outskirts of Bethlehem. The town was alive with commotion, its narrow streets bustling with people who had come to register for the census. The faint glow of oil lamps flickered in windows, casting shadows on the worn stone walls of tightly packed houses. Voices filled the air, laughter, arguments, the cries of children, all blending into a caucasity that spoke of a town stretched beyond its capacity. Joseph led the donkey carefully through the crowded streets, his hand firm on the reins as he guided Mary past groups of travelers gathered outside inns and makeshift shelters. "Stay close," he said over his shoulder, his voice low but steady. Mary nodded, her hands gripping the saddle tightly as the noise and movement swirled around her. Every corner of Bethlehem seemed to be overflowing. Inns displayed signs that read, "No vacancy," their courtyards packed with travelers sitting on blankets or leaning against their belongings. Even the alleyways were crowded, filled with families huddled together under the open sky. The air was thick with the scent of smoke from cooking fires, mingled with the earthy aroma of animals housed nearby. Joseph stopped at the door of a small inn, its wooden sign creaking softly in the breeze. He knocked, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a weary innkeeper, his face lined with the strain of a long day. "We need a place to stay," Joseph said, his tone polite but urgent. "My wife is expecting. Please, anything will do." The innkeeper shook his head, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "We're full. There's no room left, not even in the courtyard." Joseph's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "Thank you," he murmured, stepping back as the door closed. He turned to Mary, his heart sinking at the sight of her pale face. "We'll keep looking," he said, forcing determination into his voice. "There has to be a place." As they moved deeper into the town, the streets grew narrower, the press of people more suffocating. Joseph stopped at several more inns, each time receiving the same answer: no room, no space. The words began to echo in his mind, each rejection weighing heavier on his spirit. Mary's breathing grew shallow, and Joseph could see the exhaustion in her every movement. He paused in the middle of the street, scanning their surroundings desperately. "We'll find something," he said again, more to himself than to her. "We have to." The stars above began to emerge, faint and distant against the darkening sky. Their light was a small comfort, a reminder that even in this crowded, chaotic town there was still hope. Joseph tightened his grip on the reins and pressed on, his resolve unbroken. Somewhere in Bethlehem there had to be a place for them. They just hadn't found it yet. The night deepened, and the chill in the air grew sharper as Joseph and Mary pressed on through the crowded streets of Bethlehem. The once bustling roads had quieted slightly, but the town remained filled with weary travelers settling in for the night. Joseph's steps quickened, his heart pounding with the urgency of their situation. Mary's exhaustion was evident. Her breaths came shallow, her hands trembling as she clung to the donkey's reins. "Just a little further," Joseph said, his voice filled with determination, but edged with worry. He scanned the buildings around them, searching for any sign of refuge. The inns they passed were dark and silent now, their doors firmly shut. He knocked at a few more, his knuckles rapping against heavy wooden doors, but each answer was the same: no room, no space. Mary's voice broke the silence. "Joseph?" she said softly, her tone gentle despite the strain she was under. "We'll find something. God will provide." Her faith steadied him, even as his own faltered under the weight of rejection after rejection. He nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "We will," he said firmly, though his eyes betrayed the doubt creeping into his heart. They moved to the edge of town, where the streets were quieter and the houses fewer. The soft bleating of sheep echoed in the distance, mingling with the rustling of the cold wind through the olive trees. At last, they approached a small, modest dwelling with a barn attached to its side. A warm glow spilled from a window, and Joseph hesitated before knocking on the wooden door. The door opened to reveal a kind-faced man, his features etched with lines of a life lived simply. Joseph explained their plight, his words tumbling out in a mix of desperation and hope. "Please," he said. "My wife is with child. We've been turned away everywhere else. We'll take anything, just a place for her to rest." The man looked past Joseph to Mary, his gaze softening as he saw her condition. He stepped aside, motioning toward the barn. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but it's warm, and it's quiet. You're welcome to stay there." Joseph's breath left him in a rush, relief flooding his chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you." He led Mary toward the barn, his steps careful as they entered the simple shelter. The scent of hay and animals filled the air, but it was clean and calm. Joseph helped Mary down from the donkey, guiding her to a soft pile of straw where she could rest. He arranged the blankets they had brought, his hands moving quickly but gently. Mary sank with a sigh, her body finally able to relax. She looked up at Joseph, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper. A quiet faith that this humble shelter was exactly where they were meant to be. As the stars shone brightly overhead, Joseph knelt beside her, his hands clasped in silent prayer. The barn was far from the comfort of an inn, but in its quiet simplicity it felt holy, a sanctuary for what was to come. The soft glow of a lantern illuminated the barn, casting long, flickering shadows across the wooden beams and piles of straw. The air was cool but not biting, filled with the faint, earthy scent of hay and the low, steady breaths of the animals sheltered within. Joseph stood near the entrance, his shoulders sagging from the weight of the day's journey, while Mary rested against the pile of blankets he had carefully arranged. The kind-faced man who had offered them this refuge stood nearby, his hands calloused from years of labor. He watched quietly as Joseph adjusted the blankets around Mary, his movements careful and deliberate. "It's not much," the man said softly, his voice tinged with apology. "But it's quiet, and the animals' warmth will help against the night chill." Joseph turned to him, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. "It's more than enough," he replied, his voice low but earnest. "You've given us what no one else would. A place to rest, a place to wait." The man nodded, his gaze shifting to Mary. "If you need anything, call for me," he said. "I'll be just inside." He lingered for a moment longer, before retreating, the creak of the barn door marking his departure. Inside, the quiet settled like a blanket, broken only by the soft rustle of straw and the occasional sound from the animals. Joseph knelt beside Mary, his hands resting briefly on his knees as he looked at her. Her face, pale and drawn with exhaustion, held a faint smile as she met his gaze. "We're safe," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Joseph nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "We're safe," he echoed. His hands moved to adjust the blankets once more, though they didn't need it. The gesture seemed to steady him, a small action to counter the helplessness he had felt in the crowded streets of Bethlehem. He rose to his feet and walked to the barn's entrance, leaning against the wooden frame as he gazed out into the night. The stars were brilliant, their light piercing through the darkness with a clarity that seemed almost divine. Among them, one shone brighter than the rest, its glow steady and unwavering. Joseph's lips moved in a silent prayer, his words carried on the stillness of the night. He prayed for strength, for Mary, for the child they were about to welcome into the world. As he stood there, the weight of the day's trials seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a quiet resolve. When he returned to Mary's side, she had already drifted into a light sleep, her hands resting protectively over her belly. Joseph sat beside her, his back against the wooden wall, and let the stillness of the barn envelop him. This was not the place he had imagined for the birth of their child, but as he looked around the simple, humble space, he felt a sense of peace. The barn, with its rough wooden beams and earthy scent, had become a sanctuary, a place of shelter, of hope, and of faith. And in its quiet, unassuming way, it felt holy. The barn was quiet, save for the occasional soft noises of the animals shifting in their pens. The warm glow of the lantern cast a soothing light over the humble space, highlighting the wooden beams and piles of straw that surrounded Joseph and Mary. It was not a place fit for a king, and yet it was here that the greatest story ever told would soon unfold. Joseph knelt beside Mary, his hands moving quickly but gently as he arranged the blankets around her. The strain of the journey was evident on her face, but her eyes held a calm resolve, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from within. "Are you comfortable?" he asked softly, his voice edged with concern. Mary nodded, offering him a faint smile. "As comfortable as I can be," she replied, her hands resting protectively over her belly. "This is where we are meant to be." Joseph leaned back on his heels, his gaze drifting around the barn. He had imagined this moment so many times before, in a warm room, surrounded by family, with all the comforts they could offer. But now, in this simple shelter, he felt something he hadn't expected, a profound sense of peace, The quiet hum of the barn, the gentle glow of the lantern, the steady presence of Mary, it all felt sacred. He rose to his feet and walked toward the animals, who watched him with calm, curious eyes. Their presence was a comfort, their warmth a small blessing on this cold night. He gathered more straw, arranging it carefully near Mary to provide extra cushioning. Each small task steadied him, grounding him in the reality of what was to come. Mary's voice broke the silence. "Joseph," she said, her tone soft but firm. "You've done enough. Sit with me." He hesitated, his hand still full of straw, before setting it aside and returning to her side. He lowered himself onto the floor, his back against the rough wooden wall, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were cool, but her grip was strong. "We are ready," she said, her eyes meeting his with unwavering certainty. "Whatever happens, we are ready." Joseph swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. He squeezed her hand gently, his own faith bolstered by hers. "We are," he agreed, "and He will guide us." The barn fell silent once more, the stillness broken only by the rhythmic rise and fall of their breaths. Outside, the stars shone brightly, their light piercing through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting tiny beams onto the straw-covered floor. Among them, one star burned brighter than the rest, its glow steady and watchful. Joseph closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer, his words simple but heartfelt. He prayed for strength, for Mary, for the child they were about to welcome into the world. As he opened his eyes, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, a quiet assurance that they were not alone. In the stillness of the barn, surrounded by the humblest of circumstances, Joseph and Mary prepared for a moment that would change the world forever. And though the space was simple, it was filled with something far greater: hope, faith, and the promise of a miraculous birth. The soft crackle of the fire filled the barn with a gentle warmth, its flickering light casting long, shifting shadows across the wooden beams. The animals rested quietly, their steady breaths a soothing rhythm in the stillness of the night. Joseph sat near Mary, his hands clasped tightly together as he gazed at her resting form. She had fallen into a light sleep, her face peaceful despite the strain of the day's journey. In the corner of the barn, the old shepherd leaned against a post, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, were fixed on the young couple. He had seen many nights like this, where the world outside seemed vast and indifferent, but tonight felt different. There was a quiet sense of expectation in the air, a weight of something greater than any one of them. "The world has always been hard," the shepherd said, his voice low but steady. Joseph looked up, startled by the sudden sound. The shepherd met his gaze and smiled faintly. "But even in hardship, there's always hope, always a light to guide us, if we're willing to see it." Joseph nodded, his throat tightening as he considered the man's words. "It's been a long road," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And there were times I wasn't sure we'd make it." The shepherd shifted slightly, the wooden post creaking under his weight. "You've come this far because of faith," he said, "and faith will carry you the rest of the way. This place, this moment, it's part of a much bigger plan." Joseph's gaze drifted to the lantern hanging near the door, its light steady and unwavering. He thought of the star shining brightly in the sky above, a beacon that had guided them through uncertainty and fear. He felt the weight of the shepherd's words settle in his heart, grounding him in a truth he had always known, but struggled to hold on to in the midst of their trials. Mary stirred slightly, her hand resting on her belly, and Joseph reached out to adjust the blankets around her. His movements were careful and reverent, as though he were tending to something sacred. The shepherd watched quietly, his smile softening. "You're part of something greater than yourself," the shepherd continued, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "And so is she. The road ahead won't be easy, but the light you carry will guide you, and it will guide others too." Joseph glanced back at the shepherd, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. The shepherd nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow will bring what it brings, but for tonight, find peace in knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be." As the firelight flickered and the night deepened, Joseph felt a sense of calm wash over him. The barn, humble and unassuming, had become a sanctuary, a place where hope shone brightly against the backdrop of hardship. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the stillness of the night, Joseph allowed himself to believe in the promise of what was to come.
Thank you for traveling with us in today's episode of Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. If this story touched your heart, like and share it with someone who needs encouragement. In our next episode, we'll witness the miraculous night when Jesus Christ is born. Subscribe to God's story and hit the bell icon to continue this sacred journey. See you then.